kind of wild, isn't it? Thinking that just over 100 years ago, mind reading was basically, sideshow stuff.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at brain-computer interfaces.
Yeah.
Seriously talking about maybe sharing thoughts directly someday. It's a huge leap.
It really, really is. And that massive shift, from mostly disbelief to actual scientific interest, it sets the stage perfectly for what we're digging into today.
Totally. We found this fascinating old book, Practical Mind Reading, by William Walker Atkinson, published, 1907, 1908? Somewhere around then.
That's right.
So, because we know everyone wants the key info fast, we're doing a deep dive, pulling out the core ideas, the surprising bits from this book about thought transference, all that early mental stuff.
Think of it as your crash course in how people were thinking about this, over a century ago. We'll break down Atkinson's arguments, his proof for mind reading.
Okay.
Explain how we saw different types, and even cover some of the actual demonstrations he describes.
And, yeah, some of those demonstrations he suggests, they're pretty out there.
Yeah.
Finding hidden things, guessing cards, even, getting people to recreate scenes, just using thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's jump in. What was the general vibe back then when Atkinson was writing? Were people buying this? What did scientists think?
Well, that's exactly where the book starts, actually. Atkinson points out that just before he wrote it, most people were either, totally unaware or just deeply skeptical about thought transference.
Yeah.
Telepathy, mind reading, the terms weren't always used super precisely back then.
Right.
And he admits, some scientists were starting to look into these hidden truths, as he calls them, but the majority, pretty dismissive. So, even a century ago, this was definitely fringe stuff.
Okay. Not exactly hitting the mainstream science journals.
Yeah.
So how did Atkinson try to convince the skeptics? What evidence did he use?
Well, he played the authority card, you could say. He referenced opinions from some pretty big scientific names of the era.
Like who?
He quotes Professor William James. Yes, that William James.
Nice.
He was president of the Society for Psychical Research at one point.
Wow. Okay.
And James basically reflected on how past scientific views often seem, kind of narrow in hindsight. Having someone like James involved lent a lot of weight, It showed even respected figures were open to looking into it.
That's fascinating. A big name like William James. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah. He also brings in Sir William Crookes, hugely respected English scientist, president of the Royal Society, no less.
Really? And what did Crookes say?
Crookes, in a public address, actually argued that telepathy might be a fundamental law. He proposed thoughts, images could be sent, beyond our normal senses.
Whoa. That's a bold claim for a president of the Royal Society back then.
Absolutely. A very bold assertion.
How did he even try to explain how that might work with the science of the day?
Well, his theory was that for telepathy to happen, there had to be actual physical changes in the sender's brain and the receiver's brain, linked by some kind of physical chain operating through what they called ether vibrations. Remember the luminiferous ether?
Ether. Right, that old idea.
Exactly. And he even compared it to technology, the Branly Lodge coherer, which was key for Marconi's early wireless telegraph. He suggested the brain might have similar things, like nerve coherers, picking up these ether signals.
So the brain as a kind of biological radio receiver.
Pretty much. It was a powerful analogy for the time, using cutting-edge tech to explain it. Of course, the whole ether concept didn't exactly pan out scientifically later on.
Right. Clever analogy, though.
Definitely. And Atkinson also mentions Camille Flammarion, the French astronomer. Flammarion was apparently a strong believer in mind action at a distance. He compared it to established scientific facts, even likened a psychic force moving through the ether to how a telephone worked.
So getting these respected scientists on board was key to his argument.
Exactly. Using their weight to say, look, this isn't completely crazy. But beyond the experts, he also pointed to, everyday stuff. Things people experience themselves.
You mean thinking of someone and then the phone rings and it's them? That kind of thing.
Precisely that. Or when you both say the same thing at once, the just what I was going to say moment.
Yeah, happens all the time.
Or thinking of someone just before they walk in. Atkinson presents these common little things as sort of hints of this mind-to-mind connection. He even brings up sayings like, speak of the devil.
Right. Cultural nods to it.
Exactly. Those little coincidences that make you stop and think,
Did he have any maybe more structured examples? Beyond just those everyday feelings?
He does mention an interesting story about Mark Twain.
Oh, the writer.
Yeah. Apparently Twain had this habit of writing letters, really detailed ones, but then he'd just destroy them, never sent them.
Okay, why?
Well, the story goes, Twain claimed that surprisingly often, he'd then get a letter back from the person he'd written to, talking about the exact same things he'd just written about in the unsent letter.
Seriously, that's
Yeah.
intriguing. Hard to prove now, I guess.
Very hard to verify definitively, yeah. But
Hmm.
it's a compelling anecdote he includes,
Yeah,
definitely sparks the imagination.
for sure.
And then moving beyond anecdotes, Atkinson gets into the actual experiments done by the English Society for Psychical Research. He really emphasizes how carefully they tried to run these things, to rule out fraud or just normal explanations.
Okay, now this sounds more like proper investigation. What did they find?
He talks a lot about the Creary experiments. They looked into this family, a clergyman's family actually, who seemed to have mind-reading abilities.
Well,
They started simple, like finding hidden objects, the willing game, but then moved to harder stuff, naming playing cards the investigators chose, identifying hidden items, even things like reciting lines of poetry someone was just thinking.
did it work?
The success rates reported were apparently really high, like way beyond what you'd expect just by chance. Statistically improbable. That's often what pushes researchers, even if they don't understand how it works, to think maybe something unusual is happening.
Just how high are we talking? Any specific examples?
Well, in one case, one of the family members supposedly named 17 playing cards in a row, chosen by the investigator, no mistakes.
17.
Yeah. And later tests, which Professor Balfour Stewart observed, involved naming characters like Bluebeard, Tom Thumb, Cinderella correctly.
Okay.
But even more amazing, maybe, was during experiments at F.W.H. Meyer's house. One of the Crewe children apparently named the suit of 14 cards drawn consecutively. 14 suits in a row.
14 suits. The odds of that must be tiny.
Astronomical. Atkinson quotes the odds against chance as over 4 million to 1.
4 million to 1. That's hard to just brush off as luck.
It really is. And the society did other work too. Atkinson mentions experiments with a Mr. M.G.A. Smith.
Okay.
Smith apparently could reproduce geometric shapes drawn by a transmitter, Douglas Blackburn, in another room. Smith was blindfolded, no physical contact at all.
And how well did he do?
Out of 37 drawings attempted, 29 were apparently successful reproductions. And they tried really hard to block any normal sensory input, plugging Smith's ears, covering his head with a blanket, stuff like that.
Huh. So these controlled tests seem to suggest something was going on, beyond the obvious senses.
That's certainly the picture Atkinson paints. He builds this case using scientific endorsements, anecdotes, and these quite detailed experimental reports.
Right.
And he wraps up that section by basically saying, look, the best proof is trying it yourself. He encourages the reader, you, the listener, to actually attempt the demonstrations he describes later in the book. Personal experience, he argues, is the most convincing evidence.
Okay, fair enough. Try yourself. So he's laid the groundwork, tried to make the case that mind reading, in some form, is real. Then he splits it into two types, contact and telepathic. What's the difference there?
Yeah, that's a really key distinction for him. Contact mind reading is pretty much what it sounds like. There needs to be physical touch between the sender, the transmitter, and the receiver.
Okay. Touch is involved.
Right. Atkinson believed this physical link helped transmit what he called nerve currents, or even magnetism. You have to remember, these were terms floating around in the science of the time for forces they didn't fully grasp.
Gotcha. Nerve currents, magnetism, and telepathic. That's more like what we usually picture, right? Mind to mind, no touching.
Exactly. Purely mental, across distance, no physical connection needed. He uses that telegraph analogy again. Contact is like the wired telegraph, and telepathic is the wireless version, working through that hypothetical ether we talked about.
Okay, wired versus wireless. That makes the distinction clear. Why does he focus on the contact method first in the book?
He explains it as being, well, simpler, easier to demonstrate, easier to learn. He kind of presents it as the foundation, almost like training wheels for developing the wireless telepathic skills later on.
Start with the hands-on stuff before going fully mental. Makes sense. Now, you mentioned earlier the whole muscle reading idea as a criticism. How does Atkinson deal with that for contact mind reading?
Yes, muscle reading. He tackles it head on. He absolutely acknowledges that some performers, especially on stage, might rely on really subtle physical cues. Tiny, maybe unconscious, pushes or pulls from the person thinking of the object, guiding the receiver's hand.
Right, like involuntary movements.
Exactly. But he strongly argues that's not the whole story for genuine contact mind reading. He insists there's a real transmission of these nerve currents or magnetism involved, something more than just reading tiny muscle twitches.
So he's saying it's deeper than just clever observation of physical cues.
That's his claim. He even suggests fingertips, being packed with nerve endings, act like tiny finger brains, capable of both sending and receiving these subtle impulses.
Tiny finger brains. Interesting image.
Isn't it? And he offers arguments against muscle reading being the only explanation. Like sometimes the receiver seems to lead the movement, not just follow, or the transmitter's arm can be totally limp, offering no resistance to read.
Mm.
And he also mentions experiments where they inserted wires, or even had a third person act as a link between the transmitter and receiver, and apparently the effect could still work.
Okay, so he's building a case that it's more than just physical manipulation.
Right.
What's it supposedly feel like for the receiver during this contact mind reading?
Atkinson describes it as a state of intense focus, where the receiver might almost forget the transmitter is even there physically. They feel sort of drawn or impelled towards the target object.
Or being pulled.
Yeah, like an external force guiding them. Or they might get faint mental impressions, like commands, go left, stop, it's here.
Wow, that sounds quite direct, almost like remote control.
Yeah.
He also talks about the difference between stage performers and serious investigators, right?
Yes, he does draw that line. Public entertainers are often just aiming to amuse, maybe adding flashy bits, possibly even some trickery, for showmanship. Scientific investigators, on the other hand, are trying to figure out the principles. But Atkinson still believed that even in many public shows, there was enough genuine phenomenon happening to be interesting, to be worth studying.
But his main point is that anyone could potentially learn this contact method with enough work.
Absolutely. He really stresses that it comes down to practice. The transmitter needs focused will, strong concentration. The receiver needs to be receptive, passive, able to quiet their own thoughts. Practice and perseverance, he says, are key for anybody wanting to develop the skill.
Right, like learning any other skill, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have the theory, the types. Let's get into those practical demonstrations he talked about, the contact ones first.
Yeah.
How did he suggest setting them up?
He actually suggests starting a public demonstration with a little speech to the audience.
Oh yeah, what kind of speech?
Basically asking for their cooperation, their focused attention, and for everyone to kind of mentally will the demonstrator to succeed. Creating a positive, supportive atmosphere,
Yeah.
Setting the stage mentally.
Okay, getting the audience on side. What about picking the person who does the thinking, the transmitter? Any tips there?
He suggests picking someone who seems earnest, focused, ideally someone you've practiced with before so you know they concentrate well.
Makes sense.
He even makes an interesting observation. He thought women sometimes made better transmitters if they were genuinely interested because of their ability to focus intently on one thing. But if the first person doesn't seem to work out, he advises just politely trying someone else. Some people just transmit better than others, in his view.
Okay. And what instructions do you give this transmitter? What do they actually do?
The key thing is total focus. They need to fix their attention, their gaze, if possible, on the target location or object, and they need to strongly will the receiver to move towards it. The idea is that these strong mental commands, these thought waves, are what the receiver picks up through the physical contact.
So the transmitter is really driving the process with their mind. How does the receiver, the person being guided, actually start?
Atkinson describes the receiver starting with a kind of slow, passive, wavering movement, just standing loosely, holding the transmitter's hand or fingers lightly.
Yeah.
The receiver needs to be really receptive, feeling for any tiny sensation of mental resistance, or, conversely, a feeling of yielding in a certain direction. It's about following the path of least resistance, or maybe feeling a gentle mental pull. Learning to notice and trust those subtle feelings is the skill you develop with practice.
Sounds like tuning into a very faint signal. So what were some of the specific demonstrations he suggested for beginners using this contact method?
Right, he lists 14 of them. Starting pretty simple. Demonstration 1 is just finding a location. The transmitter thinks of a spot in the room and wills the receiver to go there.
Okay, basic navigation.
Then demonstration 2, finding a person. The receiver moves through the audience, and the transmitter mentally sends impressions of wrong or all right as they get closer or further from the chosen person, like that mental hot-cold game.
Right, I can picture that one easily. What's next?
Demonstration 3 is finding a small object that's actually visible somewhere in the room. This adds the challenge of sensing up or down relative to the object.
Ah, adding a vertical dimension.
Exactly. Then there's 4, finding a book, a specific book mentally chosen by the transmitter. Demonstration 5, the floral tribute, is kind of sweet. The receiver takes some flowers and has to give them to the specific person the transmitter is thinking of.
Okay.
And 6, the reunited couple gets a bit more theatrical. 2 people are chosen, and the receiver has to arrange them like a bride and groom with a third person picked as the parson.
Huh. Definitely moving beyond just finding things now. More complex interactions.
Yeah, they build up. 7th is the hidden jewelry, finding a pin or ring hidden somewhere on a person's clothing. 8th, the discovered course, means following a specific path around the room that only the transmitter knows.
Tracing a mental map.
Kind of, yeah. 9x is replacing the pin. This one requires precision. A pin is hidden, maybe stuck into something. The receiver finds it and has to put it back in the exact same hole.
Wow, that needs fine control.
It does. Then demonstration X is the theft detected. The receiver has to identify who the designated thief is, what stolen object they have, and who the victim was, all based on the transmitter's thoughts.
Like a little mental detective game.
Pretty much. Ixia is the reconstructed tableau. A few people pose, then relax, and the receiver has to put them back into their exact original poses.
Okay.
12 is maybe the most dramatic, the murder and the detective. The receiver acts as a detective, finding the body, locating the imaginary wound, finding the hidden dagger, and finally identifying the murderer, all mentally directed.
Goodness, quite the performance piece.
Definitely. The 13th is the returned hats, returning hats to their correct owners in the audience, assuming the transmitter knows where each owner is sitting. And the last one, 14th, is the lady and the ring, borrowing a ring and returning it to the correct finger of the correct lady.
That's quite a list. From simple finding tasks to these elaborate, almost staged scenes. What kind of general tips did Atkinson give for people actually trying these?
Well, importantly, he advised not doing too many feats in one go. It can be draining, mentally and physically, for both people.
Good point. Avoid burnout.
Exactly. Don't rush. Take some deep breaths afterwards to kind of discharge the nervous energy. And he really hammers home that patience and practice are essential. It's a skill like any other.
Right.
He also gives practical advice, like if a transmitter isn't working well, don't be afraid to politely switch to someone else. And he repeats how crucial the transmitter's focus and earnestness are. Oh, and a warning. Tell the audience not to hide things in impossible places or, on the transmitter themselves. That just makes it fail.
Yeah, common sense, really.
Right.
Keep it achievable. And he mentioned variations, too, like using a wire.
Yes, using a wire for contact or even having a third person act as a go-between, touching both the transmitter and receiver. But he presents those as more advanced things for after you've really mastered the basic direct contact method.
Got it. Master the basics first. Wow. This has been really eye-opening diving into this old view of mind reading. So just to wrap things up, what are the main takeaways from Atkinson's practical mind reading?
I think, well, first, it really captures that specific historical moment, right? Skepticism shifting towards curiosity, both public and scientific, about these mental powers.
Yeah.
Second, he brought together different kinds of evidence, scientist endorsements, everyday experiences, those psychical research experiments to build his case. Third, that clear split he made between contact and telepathic mind reading, with contact being the training ground.
Right, the wired versus wireless idea.
Exactly. And finally, just the sheer range and detail of those practical demonstrations he laid out. It shows how seriously they were trying to test and showcase these abilities back then.
It really is amazing to see how they were thinking about mental connection over a century ago. It definitely makes you think.
It really does, doesn't it? Looking at this old book with its focus on will, concentration, receptivity, it kind of makes you wonder, what potential does the human mind still hold that we haven't fully tapped into? And maybe how do these early ideas about mental influence connect, if at all, to what we're exploring now with neuroscience, consciousness, maybe even those brain-computer interfaces we mentioned at the start?
Really interesting questions to chew on. Well, if you, listening, found this dive into Atkinson's world intriguing, maybe look into some of that early psychical research history, or the scientists he mentioned. It's a truly fascinating corner of intellectual history.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of practical mind reading from the early 20th century.